Hey everyone, this is the Rewriter writing in. For today's video, I'm going to be making the prequel to my upcoming original Spider-Man movie series. This initially started as a rewrite of Spider-Man 3, but because I wanted to essentially redo the entirety of the series to fit my vision of the characters, I decided to try my hand at creating my own Spider-Man series. This is going to be a big project set in my version of the Spider-Man mythos, and I wanted to kick it off with a prequel focusing on my favorite villain, the Green Goblin. I'm excited to share my take on the character and his origins. By making this prequel, I can spend more time fleshing out Norman and his motivations so that by the time I get to the first Spider-Man movie, you already understand him, and we can spend more time fleshing out Peter and his friends. But before we get into the story, if at any point you find yourself enjoying the video, leaving a like and subscribing would be greatly appreciated. It makes me excited to continue my longer series when I know there are people who enjoy it, so thank you. But with this intro out of the way, let's dive into Rise of the Goblin. An armored vehicle flies through war-torn streets, bullets sparking and deflecting off its battered hull as it trudges through the wake of bodies. Soldiers on both sides of the war rush each other from opposite ends as the death toll continues to grow. Grenades and missile strikes surround them, sending debris flying into the air like pillars. Inside the vehicle are a squad of 6 soldiers, armed to the teeth. As the vehicle drives around a bend, it's sent careening into a building with unbelievable force as the right side of the truck caves in. Picking themselves off of the floor, the soldiers grab their weapons and kick down the bent truck as they file out. Instead of seeing a barricade, mine, or other trap, they see only one Iraqi soldier standing in the middle of the decimated street. Moving closer to apprehend him, the US soldiers shout for him to drop his weapon. He's outmanned and outgunned. One of them moves behind him with cuffs, seeing that the man begins twitching and breathing heavily and erratically. He turned his head around slowly, his eyes bloodshot, with blood stains around his mouth that had dripped down his beard, and in an instant, he grabbed the soldier by the neck and threw him several feet into the air. The soldiers opened fire on him, but he moved between them like lightning, striking aggressively and quickly. His punches were like freight trains as he punched clean through a few of the soldiers as his hand stuck out of their backs. Bullets that were hitting him in the chest and legs seemed to leave him unfazed as he was relentless. Upon request for backup, more infantry came to their aid, having little effect stopping him. Soldiers were dying left and right until the unexpected happened. The man began to wail horrifically before picking up one of their guns and shooting himself in the head. Stunned and relieved at the same time, the remaining soldiers stared at the body as a field leader instructed them to bring the body back to base camp. When looking for the soldier who had been thrown, they found no trace of him. A search party was ordered for his return. A couple hours later, the mutilated body rested on a gurney that was brought to the medical tent, where a doctor was ready to begin examining the body, which was extraordinarily large for a person like this. Aside from the not-so-subtle head wound that ended his life, the doctor also noticed that there were several small holes along his chest and arms, no bigger than the size of a syringe needle. And aside from the obvious blood splatter all over his hands, the doctor noticed a distinct residue: stainless steel. Extracting a blood sample, the doctor placed it into a reader that would take several minutes to analyze. As soon as the process finished, Colonel Lance, along with combat engineer Norman Osborn, came into the room as the colonel asked the doctor what he had learned. Pulling up the test results onto a computer screen, the doctor explains that the initial test had finished, which yielded interesting results. One of Norman's gadgets begins beeping as he quickly grabs it and analyzes the markings on the body. Continuing, the doctor states that his bloodstream had been heavily polluted with a series of body and mental enhancing drugs. Looking at the size of the body's muscles and overall physique, it's no surprise to find nandrolone and HGH, stimulants that greatly increase the size and overall performance of the body. EPO pops up in the bloodstream too, which is understandable considering the amount of endurance and overall pain resistance he exemplified. Curious though, a nootropic has also been found in his bloodstream, modophyllin to be precise. It's been dubbed the genius pill for its cognitive enhancing abilities, yet this proved unfruitful due to the way of his demise. Looking at the computer screen, the Colonel comments that this man seemed to be a Frankenstein's monster of drugs and pills, yet this still doesn't add up. Most of these grant peak human conditioning, he'll give them that, but not on any scale that he displayed. There has to be something else, he finishes, as Norman's beeping device starts to irritate him, and he orders him to turn it off. Osborn, glued to his device, finally looks up at the Colonel, telling him that there was nothing natural about this. He was an experiment. The Colonel tells him to go on, which Osborn continues that all of the chemicals found in his body were merely to prop up the main catalyst. The device he had been studying is a radiation detector, which when he walked in the room lit up like a Christmas tree. Looking at the stainless steel residue on his hands, the most common type of metal found in laboratories, it's clear that he was placed in some sort of machine for experimentation. Things started to add up once he was able to get a read on the type of radiation his device was picking up. It's very uncommon. In fact, it's only been used one other time in history. The radiation in question is derived from nitramine, a chemical created by Howard Stark in 1942, which he dubbed Vita radiation. The Colonel's eyes widen as he asks Osborn if he's correct in understanding what's going on. Osborn nods his head, telling him that they are trying to recreate the super soldier serum that created Captain America. The Colonel gulps and scratches at his chin, stating that if they don't get to the bottom of this and stop it, the East will have a weapon or weapons of unstoppable power. Osborn tells him not to fear. He can calibrate his device to track the radiation straight to its source. Colonel Lance orders Osborn to take a Black Ops strike team and guide them to this route location. They need to end this tonight. His heart rate elevating dramatically, Osborn nods his head in obedience. The Colonel's fear leapt into Norman's heart, albeit for a completely different reason. Once night fell, Osborn and his team moved out as he briefed them on their mission. They needed to ride for a while until he got a strong Vita radiation read on his device. Once they got a hold of the central direction they needed to head in, Osborn explained that their mission is to infiltrate whatever facility the Iraqis are holed up in and shut this project down. As the truck pulled in front of a massive facility, Osborn took one last look at his device, which showed an incredible spike in Vita radiation. He explained to them that this was it. This was the facility, no doubt about it. They'll find the serum they're looking for in there. As they all shuffled out, Osborn determined to stay in the truck. One of the agents told Osborn he needed to go with them. They still don't know where the serum is exactly. Osborn tells them that it will be better for them if he just stays here. He won't be much help in combat. They aren't having it and tell him that they can't complete the mission without him. Osborn breathes in, grappled with fear, and tells them to keep an eye on him. A couple of the agents laugh at him, treating him like he was a pansy, but that isn't why Norman needed them to watch him. It was something far more dangerous. Attaching silencers onto their weapons, the squad forms out, taking out a few soldiers on the outer perimeter. Keeping himself behind them, Norman tells them where to go based on Vita spikes. As they make their way down the dimly lit corridor, a foul stench becomes apparent behind a set of double doors. Kicking the door in and preparing for hostiles, all they see is a room full of dead bodies. Scanning them, Osborn detects Vita coming off of them, as well as seeing the same syringe marks as the soldier on the battlefield did. Each of them to a varying degree also had some sort of scarring on their heads with blood under their fingernails. However this serum works, one thing was apparent. It caused severe mental degradation. These are all failed test subjects. Osborn instructed them to move on. There was nothing that could be done for them. Anger started to well in him at how inhumane these quote-unquote scientists really were. But he had to suppress that anger, for everyone's sakes. Continuing down the corridor, the agents take down a few more hostiles until they stop in their tracks as the facility's lights flicker on and off wildly. The Vita levels were off the charts now, and it came from the central testing room directly in front of them. They ran over to the door and looked inside as the latest test subject came out of the tube. It was the soldier from before who had vanished after the chaos of the initial super soldier fight. One of the agents was friends with him, and it killed him to have to watch him suffer like this. So he decided to burst in before they had any sort of plan ready. Barreling in, rifles at the ready, the Black Ops agents ordered the scientists to get back or get shot. They began shouting in Arabic, but the message was still clear: stay away from our experiment. The agent rushed to his friend, who was in a daze, and tried to get him to wake up. The other agents started grabbing scientists to bring them back to the truck. The agent was finally able to get his friend to wake up, but when he did, he began choking the life out of him. The soldiers dropped the scientist and rushed to his aid, but it was too late. He had killed him. He turned his sadistic gaze to them as they opened fire on him, but he was too agile and began punching them through much the same way. All Norman could do was watch in terror as his fellow soldiers were being mutilated. He tried to stop him by sticking a knife in his back, but was quickly backhanded, sending him flying back into the wall. After all the Black Ops agents were dead, the man looked down at Norman with such sadness and anger. The man he once knew clawed his way back for just a singular moment to gaze at Norman. But then he shrieked, shooting himself in the head too. Norman was stunned, immobilized. The horrors he had just witnessed were far greater than he had imagined. He couldn't think straight, couldn't move. The sounds of screaming women and children played in his head as he could almost hear them being tortured and experimented on before their untimely deaths. Turning his gaze to the awestruck scientists, a fire burned so hot inside Norman, like the pits of hell. And out of that hell came a demon with unimaginable rage, a goblin locked in the recesses of Norman's mind that would finally burst through. Norman was no longer there. It was Goblin's turn, and there would be a reckoning to pay. Pulling his knife out of the corpse of the failed super soldier, the Goblin tore into the scientists with such ferocity that their bodies were brutalized beyond any sort of recognition. The Goblin laughed as his victims were flayed apart. It had been too long since the Goblin was able to take control. It was exhilarating. But it came to an end as a group of soldiers pulled him off the bloodied scientists and Norman regained control. He began apologizing, saying that he just lost it after his men were murdered. They told him it was going to be fine, but that he needed to leave while they extracted the serum. Confused, Norman told them that the mission was to destroy the serum, not take it. The soldiers pushed him aside, telling him that orders changed and that it was to be used for research. Norman yelled for them to look around. All this carnage was caused by that serum, and he wasn't going to leave until they destroyed it. But they knocked him out, retrieving the serum and taking him with them. With the war having ended, Norman returned home, relieved to finally see his wife Emily again. As happy as he was to see her, the pain and suffering from the war would constantly linger in his mind. After they kissed, his butler Bernard greeted him, telling him that some of his friends were in the living room to congratulate him for making it home safely. Among those who were there was his father-in-law, Wilson Fisk, and his right-hand man, Alistair Smythe, standing around having drinks. Smythe walked over to Norman and shook his hand, telling him that things haven't been the same without him. They walked over to Wilson as he shook his hand saying that he was overjoyed the prodigal son had returned. Norman scanned the room, looking for his aged father, no doubt scolding the hired help, but he was nowhere to be found. He asks Wilson where his father was as he finished his last sip of wine and put his giant hand on Norman's shoulder, asking him to accompany him into one of the empty spare bedrooms. Smythe trailed along behind them as Wilson led Norman to the room and shut the door behind him, shutting it in front of Smythe's face. Smythe pouted in annoyance and turned around back to the party. Wilson motioned for Norman to sit on the bed as he sat beside him, almost causing the bed to split in half from his sheer weight. He proceeded to tell Norman how that only a short time after he had deployed for military service, his father had suffered a heart attack. The doctors did all they could, but in the end, it wasn't enough, and he passed away shortly after. Contemplating all this, Norman didn't know what to say. Amberson Osborne was a complicated man. On the one hand, he had moments of genuine affection for his son, giving him access to the best education an aspiring engineer could ever have, and told Norman that he might be able to run Oscorp one day. But, on the other hand, Amberson was stern, unyielding, hard on him, to the point where he would get slapped for stepping out of line. He wanted to raise Norman to be strong, but at what cost? And sadly, a part of Norman always hated his father for his treatment of not only himself, but of Norman's mother too. Unfortunately, in these last few years, his mother had passed away, who felt like at times was the only one who was able to rein Amberson in when he had one of his anger bouts. He always called it the Goblin inside him, the Osborne curse that had been passed down for many generations, which now afflicted Norman. It was almost like he understood his father, but his hatred for him outweighed sympathy. Without his mother, it was hard to stand being around him anymore. The second he had the chance, Norman moved out, thankfully finding Emily and allowing him to start a life of his own. And even though Wilson had his quirks, he looked up to him more than his own father. His father always had this saying, Osborns fight, they don't cower in the face of danger. Yet Amberson hadn't spent a day of his life in any sort of service, and when the War on Terror was declared, Norman knew that it was his chance to make his father look weak. He was no soldier, but every day of his life felt like a fight of control in terms of pulling him back from doing unspeakable harm to his father. And he couldn't stand to work at his father's company any longer, which gave him all the incentive he needed. Leaving Emily would be one of the hardest decisions of his life, but it was the only one that he was 100% sure about. And Wilson was one of the only people who fully supported him in this decision. After not speaking for a moment, Wilson tells him that he understands that this is a lot to take in, but that he is doing his best to run the company in his father's absence. He goes on to explain that when his father passed, because Oscorp and Fisk Industries were in a partnership, it gave him the authority to run the company while Norman was in combat. Because even in combat and miles away from home, once Amberson died, Norman became the majority shareholder. And now that he has returned, it was time for him to step in and run the company. At first, Norman didn't know what to say, but eventually got out that he wasn't interested in running the company. Wilson put his hand on his shoulder, saying that he didn't have to tell him that his father was a tough man to work for, but his company served America. It provided hundreds of Americans with jobs, giving them a quality of life they never would have had without Oscorp. Amberson may not have been loving, but he did his best to serve the nation, and it's only fitting that his son, a better man than he, continued down that path. He tells him to not do it for his father, but do it for all the people who his father helped. Norman was at a crossroad. While he didn't like the idea of having to step up and run a company, he also didn't want to let everyone down. His father was cruel, but Wilson was right. He did help people, although more indirectly than Wilson made it out to be. On top of that, he needed to provide for his family, and seeing how most war vets were viewed these days, it was going to be tough finding a well-paying job early on. After thinking for a moment, he told Wilson that he's not sure if he's right for this job, but if it will help people, then he'll do it. Wilson reached out his hand to shake Norman's, pronouncing him as the CEO of Oscorp. Emily opens the door, telling Norman that his guests are wondering where he went. Wilson laughs, telling Norman that his people need him, now that he's the big shot. Emily's look of curiosity turns to playful antagonizing as she tells Norman to stop cowering from his friends. Before he can leave, Wilson tells him that together, they'll change the world. Later that evening, when everyone left, Norman helped Bernard clean up and asked him how things have been around here since he's been gone. Bernard explained that it was difficult to bury his father, even though they both knew how he was. Bernard had respect for what he had created, not only his business, but Norman as well. Norman answers that he's sorry he wasn't there to help with the funeral arrangement, but Bernard shakes his head, saying that he was fighting for their country. He was making his father proud. Norman replied that he wasn't sure if that was something he ever wanted. Bernard tells him that whatever he chooses to do now, it will be his decision to make, not any more pressuring from his father. Norman needed to hear that more than he thought he did, thanking Bernard for the sentiment. He then asked about Emily and how she was doing. He explained that she was sad without him there, but she had kept herself busy at the university, even being promoted to the dean of the science division. Norman wasn't surprised. She had been working towards that for a while, and she was the most qualified by a long shot. After cleaning up the rest of the dishes, Norman thanked Bernard and told him to go get some rest. Bernard happily obliged, telling him that he was glad to see him home. Norman went to the bedroom where Emily was getting ready for bed. She hugged him, telling him that she missed him every day and was sorry about his father's passing. Norman told her that he wouldn't leave like that ever again and thanked her for her thoughts. Emily says that she should hope not, and Norman takes a seat on the bed. He congratulates her for her promotion, telling her that she absolutely earned it. She kisses him on the cheek, answering that it was only because of his support for her. She also asks what he was talking about with her father. He tells her that he was filling him in on his father's passing, as well as telling him about the CEO position of Oscorp. Emily squeezes his hand, answering that this is exciting news, but Norman seems reluctant. He answers her if she genuinely thinks he would be any good in that position. He's never led people, only followed orders. She explains that not only is he a genius, but he's compassionate and hardworking, qualities that make for great leaders. Norman answers back that he's not always very compassionate. There really is a monster inside him. Emily grabs his chin gently and faces it in front of her, telling him that he might have this issue, but they'll always work on it together. He has her support. Norman candidly tells her that he doesn't want to become his father, always flying off the handle. No matter how much mental torment Osborns endure, there's no excuse for what his father did to his family. Emily reassures him that he isn't his father, and she won't let that happen to him. Things are different. Norman tells her that he hopes so as he closes his eyes and rests his head on a pillow. Screams are heard as the cries of helpless civilians flood into an empty void. Explosions of light and bullets whiz past in a frenzy, and then all goes silent as maniacal laughter slowly and quietly starts to build until nothing can be heard but laughter and screaming. Norman shoots up in a panic as he's covered in sweat and looks around him, only to see a peaceful setting, a warm bed, Emily laying beside him, and rays of light poking through the shutters across the room. Emily begins to stir and he puts her hand on his chest, telling him that it was only a nightmare, nothing more. Norman apologizes for putting her through this for over a year now. Emily consoles him, saying that this is normal for someone who has been through trauma like himself. He shouldn't be ashamed of it. Sitting up, he rests his hand on her pregnant stomach and smiles as he starts to get up. Emily looks over to him, stating that today will be the day she can feel it. He thanks Emily as his heart started to beat a little faster. Being the CEO of Oscorp had its benefits, of course, but Norman missed the simple days of being told what project to work on and hunkering down at his workstation to finish it in peace. But those days were long past, as every day involved executive meetings and oversight on many projects. Most of the projects were your average household technologies that did things like switch the lights on and off and raise and lower the temperature of the house, but there was one project in one division that Norman was particularly excited about, which was a government contract to develop a prototype surveillance vehicle in the form of a stealth glider. Norman was excited for two reasons. The first and obvious reason being that it was an exciting new development in modern warfare and surveillance, but the other reason was that so Oscorp could finally get a good payout that would get them out of their financial rut that they were in. But what seemed like a dream project kept hitting roadblock after roadblock, from the glider malfunctioning to pilots getting injured from crashes. All the tinkering that Norman's team had been doing seemed for naught, and Norman became increasingly stressed as time went on. But all of that was in the past, as this was the final inspection day, with the inspection given this time by Colonel Lance, which relieved Norman that at least a familiar face was coming instead of the usual military schmucks sent to Oscorp. Lance walked in and shook Norman's hand, telling him that he's moved up in the world rather quickly. They both chuckled as Norman says that he still can't get away from the military, no matter how hard he tries. Lance explains that he's looking forward to this inspection. This is groundbreaking technology. Norman explains that it has been fine-tuned countless times. It will run without a hitch. Leading Colonel Lance and a few other soldiers out to a testing ground, Norman gave them each goggles for the inevitable dust that will be thrust into their eyes from the exhaust of the glider. The test began with Oscorp's pilot ascending into the air with minimum effort as dust shot out from every corner of the surface area the glider was on. The glider was loud, emitting lots of heat from its thrusters. The pilot then demonstrated how to turn the glider's stealth mode on with the press of a couple buttons on his gauntlet pad. In an instant, the main thruster shut down, with the glider hovering using only the lower thrusters, which reduces the noise to near silence. The outer shell raises up, emitting a frequency that scrambles detection devices, making it invisible to radar tracking. Lance looks over to Norman, giving him an approving nod while claiming that he is impressed. Norman smiles, saying that he's seen nothing yet. Upon Norman's hand signal, the pilot lowers the glider enough so that he could get off. The pilot begins to control the glider from his gauntlet. Norman tells Lance to step into the small bunker there and watch. It isn't over yet. 3 drones come from behind as the glider quickly spins around and begins a dogfight. Swerving past the machine gun fire with ease, it flies above the drones and drops grenades on top of them, blowing them up in spectacular fashion. Clapping his hands, Lance commends Norman for his team's incredible work. Coming out of the bunker, the glider was hovering not very high above them. Lance grinned at the glider with pride, like it was his own son that had just won some school prize. He put his hand on Norman's shoulder, telling him that this glider will save lives. Norman's dread melted off of him. He had finally succeeded here, and it felt exhilarating. But it wasn't going to last. The pilot looked at his gauntlet and rushed over to Norman, telling him that the glider's readings are going off the charts. It was going back into attack mode. Before Norman could turn to the glider, he caught the faded light of a red dot flickering across Colonel Lance's cheek and grabbed him, throwing the both of them onto the ground. The glider opened fire, peppering the ground in front of them with machine gun fire. Norman scrambled into cover as he hollered for the pilot to switch the emergency shutdown on. The pilot screamed back that it wasn't working. It's like it's overriding its own programming. Running and ducking behind cover, Norman crawled into the weapons testing locker and pulled out an RPG, knowing that it was the only thing that was capable enough to destroy it. Norman ran out, screeching for the pilot to draw its fire away. The pilot threw a rock at the glider as it pivoted mechanically towards him and opened fire. It was now or never. All the hard work that he had poured into this project was going to be up in flames in seconds. He hesitated for a moment, but lives were at stake, so he pulled the trigger, jetting the rocket into the back thruster of the glider, causing a massive explosion. It fell to the ground with a booming thud. Colonel Lance, in shock and panic, soon turned to anger as he demanded Norman to explain what on earth just happened. Norman, in disbelief, muttered that he had gone over the diagnostics hundreds of times at this point. He should have known who was friend or foe. Lance yelled that clearly it didn't know, and he's shutting this project down. Norman turned to him, saying that he can't shut this down, he just needs more time, he'll fix it. Lance shakes his head, stating that he's had enough time. His glider almost killed everyone here. This project is finished, along with the government funding that Oscorp's been receiving. Norman started to panic again. If this project gets shut down, a large portion of this quarter's income will go down. People will no doubt get laid off. His mind began spiraling to all these conclusions. How the business could go under, how people will be out on the streets, that his family's legacy would be tarnished. Dark thoughts clouded his mind as the Goblin began peeling back the layers of his psyche until there was nothing left but him. Norman's eyes shot to Lance, staring at him with disgust as in an instant he lunged at him, grabbing onto his throat and dragging him to the ground. He began to shout that Lance had no idea how much he had sacrificed to this company, this long year of stress and overwhelming pressure. He wasn't even fazed by the number of scientists and engineers trying to tear him off of Lance. It wasn't until Emily's terrified voice came into his head. It was like she was standing right there, crying and begging him to stop. All of a sudden, Norman regained control and shot back in fear, mumbling and shaking that he was sorry he doesn't know what just happened. Lance gets up slowly, hands around his neck, and tells him that he would be hauling him off to jail right now, if it weren't for the fact that he was a veteran who served under his company. He knows Norman is a good man, but clearly something was off about him. He's willing to give him a warning, a serious warning, telling him to clean up his act, because the next time he pulls a stunt like that, he'll be rotting behind bars. Lance brushes off his uniform and tells them that they will be hearing very soon from his superiors. Norman stood up, looking around at the glaring yet fearful eyes of his team. He felt so much shame, telling them that he had ruined this day, that they all should just go home. He'll clean the place up. Hours later, when all of Oscorp was empty, dark, and quiet, Norman was still there, sorting through all the rubble of the glider. He was surprisingly able to reactivate the glider, but on very low power mode. Digging through the code, he noticed something odd. It was a spike embedded into the code that activated only on command. Dread started to build within him, knowing that this wasn't put here on accident. Someone actually activated the spike, which caused it to attack them. But why? And who would do this? Just as his brain was attempting to sort through this new and terrifying information, his phone thundered out a ringtone which spooked him. Upon picking it up, he noticed that it was Emily and answered it. Breathing heavily and a bit panicked, Emily tells Norman that she's going into labor and Bernard is taking her to the hospital now. She tells him to meet her there in 20 minutes. She sounded nervous, so Norman told her not to worry. Everything was going to go great. They were adding to their family. Nervously chuckling, Emily tells him not to be late. She misses him and needs him by her side. Norman tells her that he's on his way right now and flips the phone down, grabbing his coat from off the chair. As he's turning out the lights, he notices across the way in Fisk Industries that there were lights flashing in a window. At first he thought nothing of it, but then he witnessed an erratic person flailing about, and when they took another step, they were shot in the head as blood coated the window. Horrified, the sweet thoughts of Emily and his family drained out of him as he shut the door behind him and darted for Fisk Industries. Bursting through the front door, the receptionist wasn't there, so Norman hopped over the divider and sprinted to the elevator, pressing the button for the 13th floor. He was now covered in sweat and panic, wondering what was happening, and more importantly, Where was all the security or the police? Drenched in sweat, Norman feared the worst, hoping Wilson was okay so that he could see his grandchild. He bolted out of the elevators as the doors creaked open and dashed to the lab where the person was killed. As he was running, the lights in the hallway were flickering uncontrollably. Norman saw that the doors were closed and charged with his shoulder, slamming the doors open. What he would witness would shock and devastate him. Wilson and Smythe with a gun standing over a dead body. A quick glance of the room would reveal the rest of the story, as he saw a pod with tubes flowing into it, and to his horror, the glowing green chemical he was all too familiar with. It was Iraq all over again, but this time caused by his father-in-law. All Norman could utter out was a simple question. Why? They both turned around as Wilson gave a heavy sigh, saying that things were just not going his way today. Norman spoke again before Wilson could say another word, demanding to know how he got his hands on this and why he was experimenting on people. Wilson coldly answered that Norman was never meant to see any of this. In fact, he was hoping Norman was already out of the picture. Norman, angry and disturbed, fit the last piece of the puzzle together, sadly acknowledging that Fisk was the one who activated the hidden spike in the glider. Fisk answered back that it's much cleaner to have the CEO of Oscorp die in some tragic accident than in cold-blooded murder. Norman, now furious, screamed at him, demanding to know why he would do this to his own family. He yelled for him to think about Emily and his grandchild that was going to be born soon. She was at the hospital right now waiting for the two of them. Wilson remarked that he indeed got that very same call from his daughter, but he has priorities that need addressing, such as taking over Oscorp. Norman was confused and saddened that the one person who he thought treated him like a real father now tried to end his life. Norman lashed out that Fisk could have just taken the company while he was at war. Why didn't he? Fisk casually answered that he was hoping the war was going to take Norman out of the picture, as Amberson was being taken care of here by Smythe. Norman shot Smythe a piercing glare as he simply gave a devilish grin back, coyly saying that he didn't feel any pain and to trust him. Fisk continued, saying that once Amberson died, the ownership of Oscorp fell onto Norman, in which case Fisk couldn't take the company without him being out of the picture too. Once Norman came home, Fisk needed to hatch another plan, all while retaining his subtlety. That's why an accident at work would have provided the perfect cover. Once he has Oscorp, he could use their equipment and their engineering know-how to perfect this serum, providing Fisk Industries with an unlimited source of income from infinite government funding, as this would be the future of warfare. And as for getting the serum, he has powerful allies. It didn't take much convincing after a few $1 million were handed their way. Norman screams out that Fisk is insane and that he's shutting all this down and getting the police. As he turns around, 2 security guards are behind him, and one pulls out a baton and smacks him across the face with it. Falling to the ground, the guards pick him back up as Fisk explains that after all he's seen and heard tonight, he's afraid that won't be happening. He remarks that he liked Norman, he really did, and this isn't personal, it's just business. Aching, Norman demands to know what he's going to do with Emily. Just take her out too? Fisk chuckles, telling him that won't be necessary. She knows nothing. She'll be taken care of. He has Fisk's word. Smythe chimes in, licking his lips while saying that he'll take real good care of her. Norman struggles, screaming that if he lays a finger on her, he's immediately whipped in the jaw with Smythe's pistol as he then points it at Norman's head, saying that he's been wanting to do this for a long time. The Goblin starts to claw his way out until Fisk tells Smythe to stop. Irritated, Smythe reluctantly pulls the gun away from Norman's head, asking Fisk what he wants to do with him. Fisk tells him that there's enough serum left for one more subject tonight. Perhaps Mr. Osborn would be willing to be that subject for them. Norman screams out for them to let him go. They have no idea what they're dealing with involving that serum. They ignore him, forcefully strapping him down in that tube and getting the syringes ready. As the serum flows through the tube, Fisk states, "All in the name of science, right, Norman?" As the tube door closes, Norman begins to scream as the building's lights flicker erratically. Fisk, intrigued to see what would happen next, waits for a few moments after the lights regain control and Norman is silent. He then orders the tube to be opened as a puff of smoke is released and flows to the ground. Norman is unconscious as his body isn't moving. He isn't even breathing. Smythe then pulls his gun out, saying that he should just finish him off. He's probably a vegetable by now, if he's even still alive. Fisk begins to grow impatient with Smythe as he smacks the gun out of his hand, telling him to back off. He then gets close to Norman, looking into his face when Norman's eyes shoot open. Neon green replaced his brown eyes, and his face turned to sheer anger like a wild animal's, and he easily broke out of the bonds that held him down. He headbutted Fisk so hard that he dropped to the ground with a thud. He then leapt into the air, flying down onto one of the guards as he shoved his thumbs into the guard's eyes. He began to scream as the other one swung his baton at the goblin's head. The goblin turned around slowly, giving him a wicked grin before moving inhumanly quick, grabbing him by the throat and lifting him into the air, breaking his neck with ease. The sound of a bullet whizzed in the air and hit the goblin in the leg, leaving him unfazed as he turned around to see Smythe pointing his gun at the goblin with his hands shaking terribly. The goblin rolls under another shot, rips the gun out of his hand, and lifts him up with both hands before dropping him onto his knee, shattering his spinal cord. Smythe howled in pain as he laid on the ground in agony. Before the goblin could turn his attention back to Fisk, a new group of security guards burst into the room with machine guns and opened fire. Knowing he was outnumbered and outgunned, the goblin jumped through the window into the rainy, pitch-black night. A couple guards ran to Fisk's aid as the others looked out the window, seeing nothing. They tell Fisk that there's no way he survived that fall. They should be rid of him by now. Fisk snaps back that they were all being fools. He was certain the serum would have killed him. But then another thought came to him. Now that the serum finally worked for the first time, they needed to get him back, examine him to determine why the serum worked for him. He isn't dead. Fisk was certain of that. But he couldn't just send anyone to retrieve him. He needed the best. He then tells a couple of the guards to take Smythe to a hospital, and for the other guard to call in the cleaner and inform him of his newest assignment. The guard nods his head as they take Smythe out of the room, and Fisk looks out the window into the rain-soaked facility, saying to himself that Norman's going to make him a lot of money, no matter how many bodies it's going to take. Running at an inhuman speed, Norman wakes up and stops dead in his tracks, rain soaking his suit that had been all torn up. He looked down to see blood dripping down from his leg, and he lifts up the torn pant leg to reveal a bullet hole. Norman panics that he's been shot, but he doesn't remember when. He also realizes that he doesn't feel any pain. Scared still, Norman sprints into an abandoned warehouse and slams the industrial door behind him. One hanging light was still on, albeit flickering and fading fast, that hung above a reflective vat of chemicals. Norman spoke out loud, wondering what was happening. He looks into the reflection on the vat to see how disheveled he looked, only to see the reflection smiling back at him. "Hello, Norman," the reflection gleefully calls out to him. Norman turns around to see nobody behind him and calls out asking who he is. The reflection answers back that he's him, albeit a stronger, more capable version of him. Norman looks down at his leg and points to the bullet hole, asking if this was him. The reflection laughed that did happen while he was in control, but it's not an issue. He barely feels it, right? Norman's heart sinks as he starts piecing together what was happening. He asks him, "You're him, aren't you? You're the Goblin." He scoffs, saying that title is rather simple, not very elegant, but sure, he can call him that. Norman asks what happened to them, as the Goblin answers that he's been freed. Norman now figured that the serum did this to him and asks how they aren't dead or insane. The Goblin remarks that he saved them. He's been saving Norman for years now. While the serum drives others to insanity, the Goblin acted as a buffer that once interaction with the serum began, was able to develop into a split personality. Norman's phone miraculously survived the rain and the gunfire, as it begins to ring again from deep in his pocket. He looks at it to see Emily calling and moves to flip it up before the Goblin yells at him, telling him not to answer the phone. Norman calls out in anger, telling him that she must be worried about him for not getting to the hospital in time. His baby was being born. The Goblin calls him a fool, telling him that if he answers that call, Fisk will know where he is and kill him and Emily. Norman seems confused as the Goblin continues telling him that Fisk will hunt him down forever, and if he goes back to Emily, he's risking her and her unborn child's life. He calls for Norman to start thinking with his head instead of his heart, since she really means that much to him. It's only going to get him killed. Now, speaking of killing, the Goblin was planning how to brutally torture and kill Fisk for attempting to pull one over on them. Norman then asks the Goblin what he should do now. The Goblin tells him to get back to his lab and get the schematics for the glider. He knows a place they can tinker and rebuild it. Scared but trusting him, Norman does as he says and gets back to the lab. Oscorp was swarmed with Fisk security guards, in which case the Goblin regained control and made his way stealthily back to the lab, retrieving the schematics and heading down to a decommissioned underground facility that hadn't been used since the early days of Oscorp. Only few knew about this, not even Fisk. It was located in the CEO's office, and it went straight down into the underground. It was a hidden switch which was tucked away under a false bottom in the left compartment of the main desk. When activated, it would flip a bookcase around, revealing a secret elevator. Norman hadn't seen this in many years. With the only time he saw it, it was him as a small child who had hid in his father's office one time. Norman truly had forgotten about it, but the Goblin never did. Time was of the essence, but Norman only needed a few days to rebuild, and all the equipment he would need was still down there. It made him remember that this is where his father would hide out on nights that he came home late, possibly spending hours tinkering on personal projects. Thankfully, those days were long past. Over the next few days, Norman was hard at work rebuilding the glider. The phone kept ringing from Emily, but Norman wouldn't reply for her safety. The Goblin told him to get rid of the phone, but that was the one area Norman wouldn't budge on. So he had to contend with the phone constantly ringing, in addition to the family of rats that he had to keep shooing away back into the darkness that they appeared from. As the days dwindled down, the glider was coming around to being back to how it was the week prior, but this time without the spike implanted, and instead had an instant kill mode when scanning Fisk or Smythe. After a quick test flight in the musty but surprisingly well-kept facility, the glider was in working condition and ready for the field. After everything was in working condition, Norman walked over to a full-size mirror and asked what they were going to do now. The Goblin replied that they were ready to get Fisk's attention and proceeded to tell him the plan. When night fell, Fisk was at his desk in his office, reviewing schematics for the test tube as well as different results from the many tests they've run on serum patients. Hearing the faint sound of hovering, Fisk looked up to see Goblin on his glider, holding a round bomb in his hand. Fisk walked up to the glass, unfazed, telling him that he isn't afraid of him, and has in fact made his life easier by showing up right at his doorstep. He adds that he sees he got the glider all fixed up, no doubt programmed to kill him. Goblin laughs that he should be afraid, very afraid. He clicks the trigger on the top of the bomb and hurls it through the glass, exploding in the middle of the office. The explosion causes the windows to burst as smoke crawls out of the room. Cackling and looking in closer, a figure sprints at him from the smoke as a man in tactical gear and a balaclava over his face lunges at him, landing on top of the glider. He begins kneeing and punching Goblin repeatedly, making him fly down to the ground. As they are rapidly descending, Goblin swings at him, but he effortlessly dodges and weaves around the strikes. Once they reach low enough to the ground, Goblin grabs him and throws him off and jumps off, programming the glider to go after Fisk. It flies away as they continue to fight, trading blow for blow. He pulls out a silenced pistol, but it's batted away by Goblin, and he punches him in the chest, which knocks the cleaner back, but he keeps on fighting. Goblin is almost impressed with how this assailant was able to keep up with him, but that wouldn't stop him from tearing him apart to get to Fisk. Goblin punches the cleaner hard in the face, knocking the balaclava from off of him. At one point, the cleaner uses a flashbang to stun him before grappling him onto the ground and punching him repeatedly. This only made Goblin laugh as he grabbed him by the throat and launched him off. Goblin lunged at him, but he swiftly backflipped behind him, kicking him in the ribs. Goblin turns around quickly and throws another punch at him. While they're fighting, the glider flies back up to the shattered window of Fisk's office, as Fisk, his white suit now covered in debris, is fleeing with a few of his guards. The glider opens fire on the guards, riddling them with machine gun fire. Fisk barrel rolls into a side room as the glider is fanning gunfire everywhere. Once it stops firing, it seeks after Fisk, quickly scanning the environment until all of a sudden it jerks around as Fisk grabs it and slams it onto the ground. It spins around, slicing Fisk in the shoulder with its jagged edge. It then drops another bomb close to him, but this time he grabs the glider, using it as a shield to deflect the blast. This works and causes the glider to take serious damage in the process. The glider sends a signal to Goblin's gauntlet, alerting him that it has taken damage. Goblin is able to kick the cleaner hard in the chest, giving him a moment to give the glider a different directive, that of stealth surveillance. The glider obeys the command, flying out of the building and leaving Fisk. Back with Goblin and the cleaner, Goblin becomes less aggressive, starting to only block blows instead of attacking back. He hardly notices as the cleaner becomes more aggressive, punching and kicking Goblin with every martial art and fighting style he knows. A light on Goblin's gauntlet flashes green, and he punches him in the stomach with so much force that it sends him flying into the air and sends him crashing next to his gun. Goblin activates his gauntlet, showing the glider's facial analysis on this man was complete. His name? Richard Parker. Grinning from ear to ear, he sent his glider away as he started laughing uncontrollably at the man. Looking to his left, Parker sees his gun, picks it up and stands. He points it at Goblin, but Goblin doesn't react. He just simply laughs more. Ending this nightmare once and for all, Parker puts 2 bullets right into the chest of Goblin as he falls to the ground. Parker, majorly injured, puts his pistol back in the holster and turns on his comms device, telling Fisk that he had completed his mission. Osborn was dead. Fisk yells at him, telling him that he needed Norman alive so that he could test his cognitive functions and analyze how he was able to survive the serum injection. He tells Parker to wait for him so that he can see the body for himself. Moments later, Fisk arrives, seeing Norman's lifeless body on the ground with a wicked smile across his face. Fisk, knowing that Norman was now only a liability instead of a cash cow, he kicks his body in anger. Late as usual, the police show up, asking Fisk what this was all about. He tells them to burn the body, ensure the press thinks this was an accident, an experiment gone wrong. The officer nods his head, telling him that they'll take care of it. Moving his body into a body bag, the officer looks at the face with disgust before zipping up the bag past his face. A mother holds her 6-month-old child in her arms as she hums a melody to him and puts him in his crib. She kisses him on the cheek, softly saying that she loves him very much. Once she sets him down, she turns around and sees her husband leaning against the door frame. She steps towards him, hugging him as they both close the door together. He kisses her, telling her that now the Parker family is complete. She giggles, saying that she couldn't feel any more joy now even if she wanted to. That's how happy she is. They both sit down on the couch exhausted from the day, and watch some TV before going to bed for the night. As they are both about to fall asleep on the couch, they shoot up as the glass window next to them breaks and something lands at their feet. Moving the footrest out of the way, Richard sees a bomb and for a split second hears maniacal laughter. It then explodes, bathing the house in flames, leaving only baby Peter crying for help. And that's the end of my story. I hope you all enjoyed. This is a very different take on the universe and characters, but I hope that you appreciated my unique take on the source material. And like I said in my intro, Green Goblin is one of my favorite villains, so I wanted to dedicate an entire story to him. The events of this story will, of course because of this ending, have a direct impact on the stories of my eventual Spider-Man movies. I'm excited to bring you all my take on the universe, and I really hope that you guys will enjoy it as much as I do. And for those of you who stuck around for this entire story, I want to reward you with this first look at my design for Green Goblin in my universe. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed, leaving a like helps me out, and please leave a comment. I love reading and responding to them. I'd love to hear what you thought of this story. And if you want a place to talk to fellow members of this growing community, there is a link in the description for my Discord channel. I'd love to see you there. So, thanks again everyone, and this is the Rewriter writing out.